I've never talked about something more than I have Dark Souls 3. I've created hundreds of videos on this game, I've written countless pages of text delving into the specifics, the lore, and the mechanics, so I feel fairly confident in my ability to give the game a fair trial. We'll be looking at Dark Souls 3 in its final form, DLCs included. Not only that, but today I'll be going over the journey Dark Souls 3 has taken me on and is still continuing to do so. I've met hundreds of amazing people through Dark Souls 3, I started my own business because of this game, I even met my girlfriend through our shared admiration for the Souls series, but because I love this game and franchise so much, I've played it a lot, so I'm not blind to its faults. Even though I'm somewhat a Dark Souls fanboy, I'm going to go into this with a fair mindset, and we'll cover both ends of the spectrum, the good aspects of Dark Souls 3 and the bad aspects of Dark Souls 3. Where they could have improved certain elements, and where certain elements shined. These are going to be my personal viewpoints regarding this game, and some of them you may not agree with, but that's more than fine, and feel free to join the conversation down in the comments. I strongly believe having a level-headed discussion about games can in turn make for them to be better in the future, and who doesn't want better games? But without further ado, this is the final review for Dark Souls 3. So where do I even start without going over stuff I've covered in the past? Well, let's start at the beginning with the Cemetery of Ash, and how this game in this first area teaches you certain aspects of the game without really telling you. Sure, there's blatant messages telling you button inputs and what they do, backstab mechanics and roles, but the layout of the initial area reveals to the player if they venture off the beaten path, they'll be rewarded. For example, if we take a right out of where the Ashen One rises, we are rewarded with souls. And yes, this isn't the biggest reward, but it's working behind the scenes to showcase, yes, there is this linear path that you can take to progress through the area, but if you venture off, we're not going to discourage you as a player. Exploration is rewarded, and this gets extended further into the risk versus reward factor. From the get-go, the concept of overcoming the odds and being rewarded for your efforts are in full effect. This is obviously referencing the ravenous crystal lizard at the beginning. And this is one of the reasons these games speak to me as a player, and Dark Souls 3 follows the trait of the initial games in where if you want to find something out, yes, the information is there, but you have to actively go in and look for yourself. This speaks for the lore of the game as well. Just as any kingdom in Dark Souls 3 offers an expansive amount of world building. Even to this day, fantastic theories are being created, and I remember when the Ring City was released and we the players got to the end and we were met with Gael. After defeating him, that was it, and many players were confused and were left wondering, and I think this ties into what we discussed earlier regarding having to go out and find the stuff instead of it being spoon-fed to you. Gael wasn't necessarily the end in the Dark Souls universe. Well, it was and it wasn't. But for us, the player, it was the end. The final piece of content we'll get for Dark Souls, and there wasn't this grand ending cutscene tying all the lore together and giving us a definitive conclusion. And although that would have been nice, that just isn't Dark Souls, and it never has been. The fact the ending was left open to interpretation in my eyes was Dark Souls being Dark Souls. Allowing the community to build upon this legacy the games have been building over the past 6 years, I do not think the Dark Souls story was ever meant to have definitive answers. Now, is this lazy writing, or is that creative storytelling? The memorable stories to me are the ones that make me think, the ones that make me question what's being shown to me, the ones that make me doubt myself. That is Dark Souls storytelling. We're not being spoon-fed segments of story, but instead we're giving the foundation, and we're told, if something in this world interests you, the basic premise is there, but you have to use your own imagination to put those various parts together and form your own story. There is no definitive story. There's a difference between, for example, a write-up on the lore and a write-up on a lore theory. Stating something as lore means there's certain facts we can pull from various sources. A lore theory is interpreting those facts and using them to kindle up a what-if scenario. There is no wrong theory. You can't necessarily dismiss a lore theory as it's just that, a theory. There's no real truth to the foggy bits in the Dark Souls lore. If you want to think a character did something or went somewhere, as long as it doesn't dismiss the facts, that's fine. Because it's a creative outlet and it's, well, it's just fun. And the reason I went into that is because, well, that's how all this got started. Me being here. You watching this video. It was the lore. The lore started my YouTube channel and I owe it for that. Using the lore and formulating my own theories is why I have what I have today. And even with that said, nobody can tell you the definitive story in Dark Souls, because that's their story. That's how they've interpreted it. The beauty of Dark Souls' story is, it's yours, and that's why it's so special. So with that in mind, the story in Dark Souls 3 has elements to the story that interested me greatly. The Pontiff's journey and Filionor's true purpose. But unlike Dark Souls 1, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 2, there was a lot of filler things in the story for me, and this is down to a personal preference. What didn't pique my interest might have had you thoroughly invested. But for example, the Soul of Cinder being the amalgamation of previous undead, never really got expanded upon, and I know I mentioned we could theorize and whatnot, but the story behind this individual, or, well, individuals, here was very definitive. And that's not really a bad thing, it's just it didn't allow the player to take their own interpretation and thus didn't really make the player think. And as I stated earlier, the stories that I connect most to are the ones that make me have to actually use my brain. But in my eyes, in Dark Souls 3, we got a solid ending that's as solid of an ending we could have got in Dark Souls. The flame is so weak at this point, no matter what we do, no matter how powerful the souls we accumulate are, it's no longer able to sustain the Age of Fire. The way world building and level design acts in the base game of Dark Souls 3 is slightly different than its predecessor. This was apparent in the Firelink Shrine at the start of the game. Instead of traversing the world to get to the High Wall of Lothric, we're thrust into the bonfire and we have a location to teleport to. I've always been vocal with my dislike for this part of the game. Back in my initial playthrough, I remember wandering around Firelink trying to figure out where to go. When I sat at the bonfire and was met with this teleport option, I felt stupid. But not in a sense of, oh, how didn't I get that? It was more of a sense of, this feels dumbed down, and it wasn't what I'd come to expect from the series. But this could be just pure elitism showing its true colours. I don't expect Dark Souls to just give me stuff without me having to figure something out, and yes, you could argue you had to figure out you had to sit at the bonfire, but that seems short-sighted, as this would pave the way for how levels in Dark Souls 3 would be created. The world of Dark Souls 3 follows this linear fashion in how we move through Lothric. In Dark Souls 1, we're given a couple of choices in how we begin our journey when we land in Lordran, but in Dark Souls 3, however, we're given but one. It opens up at various segments throughout the game, splitting into two paths. For example, in the Road of Sacrifices, we can choose to go into the Farron Swamp or the Cathedral of the Deep. Giving the player options is good, and it's something us Dark Souls players have taken for granted, and I almost feel a sense of entitlement when it comes to level design. If it's not as complex in nature as Dark Souls 1, then it's not right, or it's not good enough. But is that really fair? Well, a big part of Dark Souls is figuring out where to go. Alongside fighting enemies and developing your character, you need to know where you're going, and there's no indicator telling you this information. You are tasked with finding it out on your own. When condensed down into a linear layout, this sense of exploration gets somewhat diminished. Not entirely though, there's still places to explore within each categorized zone, nooks and crannies and items to uncover, but unlike Dark Souls 2, each zone feels relevant to the world here. It has a sense of real geometry about it. The issue here lies with giving the player choice and freedom. Yes, the worlds and or zones are beautifully crafted with a real sense of purpose and their own identity, but I would have liked to have chosen when I went into these zones rather than the game telling me. It's not until later sections of Dark Souls 1 where areas fell into linearity, but it's prevalent in Dark Souls 3 from the start. This would be fixed by no easy method. This would require paths from zones to multiple other zones and so on and so forth. For example, and this is throwing geography out of the window, but the High Wall of Lothric being connected to the Farron Swamp via an elevator, or something similar. I feel as though the reason this isn't the case is because we are rewarded with the ability to warp between bonfires from the get-go. Not only do we not have to work for the ability to warp, it completely changed the way world design played out in Dark Souls 3. If we have to work for the ability to warp, and we're rewarded with it at a later date, then perhaps we would have seen more shortcuts connecting the various early game areas and then further improving on the world of Lothric. Because as I mentioned, what we have in Dark Souls 3 is good. Very good. From a game's design aspect, it does a very exemplary job of moving the player through the world without getting them too lost. But from my perspective, I miss that feeling of getting lost, and it being because of how complex the world felt, not because I was missing out on a silly mechanic. But Dark Souls 3 is a beautiful game. Each zone has its own identity as stated earlier, the world is full of little detail I admire, and it was absent in the second game. Rooms feel like real rooms with items, breakables and geometry. It no longer feels like you're standing in a boring stagnant box. This is just a shower thought, but could you imagine Dark Souls on the Unreal or CryEngine? That would be crazy. But anyway, the aesthetic present in Dark Souls 3 is something I've always gravitated towards. The medieval fantasy is portrayed so flawlessly here, it's especially hard to beat. I remember there was a big community discussion about whether the Souls formula would work in other environments such as sci-fi or a pirate setting, for example. When we actually got our hands on this, many members of the community, including myself who previously wanted a sci-fi Souls-like, withdrew their statement. And I wouldn't say they were necessarily a reflection of those games and the quality of them, but more so, and I'm speaking for myself here, after playing a sci-fi setting I just felt as though me personally leaned towards the medieval setting so much more. Knights in armor slaying big demons and dragons with swords and magic. That's just something I prefer, and I didn't really know that until I experienced what I thought I wanted. And Dark Souls 3 furthers that, giving us a grand array of weapons and armors to choose from that we can use to slay these beautifully horrific enemies that are in the land of Lothric. One of my gripes, and I've talked about this before, is how much of Dark Souls 3 is actually Dark Souls 3 when it comes to weapons, enemies and armor. Dark Souls 3 seems to have a little bit of an identity crisis in that regard. Yes, it offers its own array of unique weapons that are unique to the third game, but there's a lot of content here that were in previous Dark Souls titles. I'm all for referencing the older games, but Dark Souls 3 I felt needed more diversity among its library of items. More Dark Souls 3, less Dark Souls 1 and 2. But even with that said, when looking at the weapons in Dark Souls 3, with the addition of weapon arts where each weapon and or weapon type has a form of special attack that consumes your focus points, with the boss and special weapons, these weapons all perform their own unique weapon art, which is fantastic. Some of them might not be very useful, but the fact that they have their own identity is welcomed. The issue lies with the basic weapons in their respective categories. Curved swords all perform the same weapon art besides variation here and there. Ultra greatswords, every category of weapon has their own weapon art, which are for that category, with some odd curveballs thrown into the mix. Now, unique weapons and in turn weapon art should remain just that. But Dark Souls 3 suffers from a certain aspect and this bleeds into PvP, but we'll go over that soon. And this is the amount of weapons in this game may seem like a lot, but a lot of them function the same. This takes away in the long run from build diversity. Even with a quality build being where you level strength and dexterity stat equally, thus letting you wield nearly every weapon in the game, even with this expansive choice, hardly any of the weapons felt, well, special. Straight swords could have had one of two movesets, great swords, one of two movesets, ultra great swords, same issue. And again, not every weapon needs to be a special snowflake, but the roster of weapons we have in Dark Souls 3, yes there's a lot, but I'd rather have quality over quantity. This is where the DLC weapons, specifically in Ashes of Ariandel, shined. The Valor Heart being one that comes to mind. If used the way it's meant to be used, which is two-handing the weapon, the moveset is totally unique with no other weapon sharing it. And I know if you don't two-hand it or dual-wield it, however you want to describe it, you'll get the standard straight sword moveset. But again, if you're using it the way it's supposed to be, it can be a lot of fun. Looking back at Dark Souls 3, I wish more weapons performed this way. Not only giving a sense of build diversity, but identity as well. I strongly believe there is no real quote-unquote fun builds in Dark Souls 3. Yes, you can use the giant doors and troll people, but where do you go from there? And this is heavily apparent in the PvP scene in Dark Souls 3. I've PvP'd so much in this game over the, well, how long has it been? Nearly 2 years? And we'll go over the PvP thoroughly soon, I promise, but a problem with the PvP in Dark Souls 3 is a lack of build diversity, with Poison being not very good, to put it lightly, Magic and Faith spells being so situational they're borderline useless, coupled with the fact that Faith and Magic builds require so much more stat and item investment to be on par with a bog standard Strength or Dex build. If you're looking at meta PvP, you'd be hard to find someone running anything along these lines, unless they're doing it for, well, the sake of doing it really. There's no way to fix this issue other than to go into the game and change how spells, including Faith spells, work. In Dark Souls 2, spells had some weird AoE effect, Poison was effective, and the build diversity was stellar. There's a reason a common mindset within the Souls community is that Dark Souls 2 was the best Souls PvP we've had thus far. So with that in mind, a lot of the tools at our disposal just fell short. Yes, you can't outright dismiss everything that's magic or faith based in the game, but I would have liked it to be expanded upon, to actually be somewhat competitive, and by no means is Dark Souls 3 a competitive game. Now in this instance, this is more catering towards the PvP crowd. In a PvP sense, spells are still okay. Yes, stat investment is awful. Basically, I'll try to briefly explain what this means. Let's say you have a level 70 strength character with the warrior starting class. You'd put 35 points in vigor, 35 in endurance, and 35 in strength. Real interesting, right? But anyway, that's a pretty standard build to have in Dark Souls 3. Now let's move over to a level 70 intelligence-based character with the sorcerer starting class. You'd have 30 in vigor, 24 attunement, 20 endurance, and 40 intelligence. Not only that, but you'd be required to equip rings that boost sorceries. Now this build obviously isn't the best, but it's usable. The issue here is having to invest so much more points into things to have them be on par with other melee builds at this level. And this gets worse the lower level character you are. Now this is quite a good debate, so I'd be really curious as to what people's thoughts on this are, and this being, if the game is more balanced, it's less fun. Now personally, I don't think this to be the case. As long as the game is giving you unique tools and multiple ways to approach how you create your character, this is an RPG after all, then I'd feel the game can be fair and balanced and still yield a good amount of fun. But the biggest issue is the lack of fun builds to delve into in Dark Souls 3. Nearly everything acts the same in the realm of melee weapons, so after a while it gets stale. It actually took me a while to figure out which was my favourite weapon in Dark Souls 3, and that wasn't the case in the previous titles. For those wondering, it's the Profane Greatsword. Why you ask? I don't really know. It looks cool, I guess, has a self buff, fire is awesome, and that's pretty much it. But onto the PvP. I have major issues with it really, and I'm going to be delving into invasions, more so 1v1 duels, and then touching on the arena a bit. But when invasions work, it's great. You go in as an invader, kill the host and reap the rewards, or die and get sent back to your world. Simple, right? Well, not really. There's things going on in the background that play a major role as to why PvP in Dark Souls 3 lacks incentive and in turn longevity. Doing PvP for fun just isn't enough. There needs to be a tangible reason to keep playing. The Covenant rewards are that incentive to PvP, but each Covenant only requiring 30 tokens per Covenant to reach max level is a small amount in comparison to how many hours especially the PvP community put into these games. The auto-summon Covenants, the Covenants that instead of actively searching for PvP you have to wait to be brought into other players' worlds by equipping a certain item, are just not fun, and half the time they don't function the way they're supposed to. Instead of getting summoned fairly regularly, the wait time can be literal hours. The community has deciphered which level range is best and most efficient to get summoned, but in reality this auto-summon mechanic just adds unnecessary inflated game time for little to no reward. From Software took action later in the game's life to improve upon the summon times by expanding the level range in which players can get summoned, and this did help somewhat, but it's still a system that has been prevalent in all the Souls games, and I've disliked them in all three. Yet in Dark Souls 3 it felt like the worst implementation of this system, as it was coupled with other systems in the online aspect of Dark Souls 3 that just didn't do it any favours. Now with this next bit, again, it might spawn a bit of hatred my way, but in my eyes the best way to play Dark Souls initially is on your own without no cooperative help. This way you experience the quote-unquote true way to play the game. Is this an elitist mindset? Yes, of course it is. If you summon on your first playthrough, I don't mind. It didn't affect my playthrough, but in my opinion, if you did that, you hindered yours. Now, referring to how this affected PvP, the invasions are a huge part of Dark Souls. They always have been. You don't have to like them or participate in them, but you have to accept them. And if you don't, well, you're a fool, to put it lightly. And in this segment, we're not going to say invaders are at a disadvantage when invading, because that needs to be the case. Invaders should be at a disadvantage because you're invading private property pretty much. The argument here is how much of a disadvantage do the invaders need to be at? Now, coming from an experienced PvPer, I'm more than happy to fight a host and his summoned phantoms. For clarity's sake, a host of the world can summon up to 3 other buddies to help them get through the world, and like I mentioned, I'm more than happy to fight multiple foes. In fact, at this stage, I welcome it. However, this was a common complaint at launch, where a singular invader would be met by 4 enemy players, and what I want you to do now is just to try and see this from a player who's perhaps a newcomer to the Souls franchise, and not an experienced player like you or I. If they invade a world for the first time and are met with this gank squad, they're most likely going to think, well, screw this and never try it again. And I might be generalizing a bit there, but that's where my mindset is. But even when you're in the world with a host and their buddies, if you kill one, they used to be able to just resummon and get back into the fight straight away. Nowadays, this has been improved on by adding a resummon timer that I think is around 2 minutes, but honestly, I think they should have just got rid of resummoning. The way I do it, me being the all-knowing Paragon, if a host gets invaded, I think it should have just disabled the ability to summon outright until the invader has been dealt with, and that's pretty much it. But my biggest issue with PvP is incentive to do so, and this speaks for the arena as well. There's just no real reason to do it, and as I mentioned, fun isn't going to carry the game's online player base for the long run, and we're seeing that day after day at this stage in the game's life. I banged on about the aura reward system from Dark Souls 2, but there's good reason for it. It was a grind, it was difficult, and it was rewarding and purely cosmetic. It ticked a bunch of the right boxes for me. It gave something to work towards for the long run, and it was fun. So to summarise the PvP aspect of Dark Souls 3, as I know we've bounced around a bit, the game lacked build and weapon diversity, and there needed to be incentive to participate in PvP outside of the easily to acquire Covenant rewards, minus the auto-summon Covenants, which were not easy to get. Bosses are one of, if not the quintessential aspect of the Dark Souls games, and the bosses present in Dark Souls 3 just showcase that brilliantly. If you could only pick one thing that's positive about Dark Souls 3, in my eyes it has to be the bosses. Let's look at, in my eyes, the worst boss in Dark Souls 3, the Deacons of the Deep, and then compare it to the worst boss in the previous titles, Bed of Chaos from Dark Souls 1, and there's a few bad bosses in Dark Souls 2, let's just say Covetous Demon. So comparing the worst bosses in Dark Souls 3 to those, you might not like Deacons of the Deep, but it's leaps and bounds better than those. But even at the other end of the spectrum, every fight has a sense of wonder, boss movesets that'll keep you on your toes. With the outstanding boss themes, each encounter is unique and rewarding. Did they drop the ball a couple of times? Yeah, sure, the biggest being Yhorm and the dragon fight, but that doesn't take away from the fights that actually are able to showcase the beautifully crafted bosses in the world of Dark Souls 3. And this is just me speaking in terms of bosses' movesets. Yes, after a while, if you've played as much as I have, the moves are easy to telegraph, but that just adds to the flowing nature of how each boss plays out. Dodging becomes seamless. Especially on your initial playthrough, the bosses are intimidating, coupled with the fact, compared to the previous games, the bosses here are fast and don't let up. To name a few of my favourite fights, Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, Medea and Gael. Gael being my favourite now, this is just a perfect fight in my opinion. The arena is beautiful despite it being a decrepit landscape. The phase transitions are fantastic, with each phase adding additional moves onto an existing moveset that you've memorized. It really throws you off. Ever since Bloodborne, From Software seemed to have a decent grasp on visually stimulating, yes I just said that, boss fights. And although I mentioned callbacks are a bit of a hit and miss, the Phase 2 section of the Soul of Cinder boss fight, when the piano starts playing, gives me chills still to this day. Not only that, but I found in this game it doesn't really give you the ability to bash your face against the boss until it's dead. Trading with bosses is risky business, And yes, you can grab yourself the twin blades and completely destroy bosses, but I'm more so referring to your initial playthrough when everything was new and you had no idea what you were doing. And I guess we could include that what we discussed earlier with the whole giving the player a choice. The fact that we can do Dancer early is awesome, and I wish more bosses were like that. Risk versus reward. Do the Dancer fight early and get better stuff and more upgrade materials. Choice is important in Dark Souls. Choice is important. I've chosen, despite all the grief I've given this game, amongst all the praise, I've chosen to continue to play it. Because I love this game. I love the people I've met because of this game. I love you guys because we share an interest in these games. You've given me so much opportunity and you've been so supportive. This franchise has taught me that if I don't get something or I can't do it first try, that's okay, because you learn, you adapt, and you get back up and you keep trying until you succeed. It's taught me it's okay to get knocked down a few times, as long as I get back up and give it some back. Dark Souls 3 is beautiful. It's not perfect by no means, but it doesn't have to be. This game still means a hell of a lot to me personally, and I'll never forget it. Now, this is by no means my last Dark Souls video, so don't worry about that. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me speak. I know it was quite a long video. If you're new here, consider subscribing for more future Dark Souls and Souls related content. That would really mean a lot to me. As always, I've been Paragon. Take care, be good to one another, and I'll see you next time.